This is Gauntlet II for Game Boy, released in 1991 and essentially a portable iteration of the NES conversion of the 1986 arcade classic. For all intents and purposes, and not counting that one Tiger handheld version, this was the only portable version of Gauntlet proper available to the masses until the release of the Gauntlet/Rampart compilation cart for Game Boy Advance later in 2005. For those unfamiliar with Gauntlet 2, or Gauntlet in general, you take control of either the Warrior, the Valkyrie, the Wizard, or the Elf, each of which has their own strengths and weaknesses, and you must battle through about 100 levels of mazes, monsters, treasures, dragons, and thingamabobs, all the while collecting food to keep up your ever-dwindling health. There's no story or campaign or anything of the sort to be found here. It's more about attaining a high score than trying to go on some grand quest to save the kingdom from, well, whatever you'd normally save the kingdom from. Gauntlet 2 was pretty much the same kind of gameplay you got with Gauntlet 1, and this Game Boy iteration does what the NES version did, minus a couple notable bits. Generally speaking, Gauntlet 2 on Game Boy is pretty much the same thing that was on the NES, which in turn was pretty much the same thing that you got in the arcades. You navigated mazes, you fought monsters, you collect loot as well as tools such as key, food, magic potions, and other assorted goodies to help you on your way. You slayed the occasional dragon that would show up once in a while, and you find the exit to the current labyrinth, all the while your health ticks away by the second. And if you have a Game Link accessory, a second player can join in on the Gauntlet fun, and both can even pick the same character. I'm not sure if you could do this with up to 4 players like in the arcade or even the NES version, but somehow I doubt it, if only because the end result would be rather problematic. Control over your hero is fairly responsive and functional for the most part. However, Gauntlet 2 on Game Boy is plagued with horrendous slowdown that causes the control to act a bit sluggish. Now, the NES version, upon which this was based, had its share of slowdown as well, but it feels even more notable here, especially when there's some digital sound being played in the audio bits. In fact, whenever that one sound that lasts a fortnight plays, or whenever there's a shitload of monsters on screen, Gauntlet 2 tends to struggle a bit, and it really puts a damper on the whole thing. Other than that though, Gauntlet 2 plays well enough on the Game Boy. There's loads of levels along with some minor attempts at variety. Once you get past the first 5 maps, or use the special warp in the very first map to skip a few levels ahead, the order in which you progress through the levels is randomized, and even then, levels will sometimes get flipped upside down or mirrored or both, so it varies the gameplay somewhat and makes for more interesting playthroughs, and that's always nice to have. Gauntlet 2 on Game Boy sports the same graphical style you saw on the NES, and while the NES version looked a bit on the bland side, on the Game Boy it actually looks pretty decent. I suppose the lack of color probably contributed to the game looking slightly better here, and at the very least, the game moves smoothly enough that if you were playing this on an actual Game Boy, as opposed to a Super Game Boy Player, or any of those devices that let you play Game Boy games on your television, the blurring wouldn't be so bad. Again, the old Gauntlet games were fairly simplistic looking games, and this version more or less recreates those visuals well enough and looks alright. Much like its arcade original, and much like the NES version that this is based on, Gauntlet 2 is lacking in background music during gameplay. Other than a couple quick jingles, music is seemingly non-existent here. The sound effects attempt to replicate the sounds of the arcade game, but come off as rough in some cases and somewhat irritating in others. I suppose the only real highlight to be found here is that they managed to squeeze in some of the arcade voice bites, and while the quality is not great, obviously, voice bites on a Game Boy title is not something you come across often, especially back in 1991, so that's something to be commended for, if nothing else. Gauntlet 2 for Game Boy is perhaps not the ideal version of the game you could be playing, whether it be today or even back in the 90s when this game was brand spanking new, but for what it is and what it attempts to do, it is a rather respectable and somewhat competent version of the arcade classic that is only marred by bouts of nigh-crippling slowdown. It's really nothing special, however, and doesn't do anything that you can't find on the NES or any of the various Midway arcade compilations that's been tossed onto over the years. But it's a rather nice addition to the Game Boy library if you're into old 80s arcade games, and you could find a copy for fairly cheap. All in all, despite a hiccup or two, this one's okay.